Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Combo Couch. I am Fiorella Isabel, and I am having a special panel today with two guests, okay? And Pasta and I have talked about having a panel like this. We probably would have had maybe one other person. I'm kind of obviously I have a certain stance, and me and Pasta argue about it all the time. Many of you have heard us talking about this specific subject. While we all agree, I think that right now there's so much happening in the world, and there is definitely a predator class that is trying to really divide us. I think some of us differ as to how we're perceiving everything that's happening. If there is actual opposition, what is the importance of this opposition? Are all governments, equal in terms of imperialism? We have differences in that. And in terms of how to deal with this whole situation that's unfolding before us, there has been, breaking news today with a case against these socialists from the Uhuru movement. That, I mean, this has been going on for a while now. And so the the Department of Justice decided that they are basically guilty of having some sort of affiliation with the Russian government, being sort of Russian assets. And I'm going to bring that up a little bit later in the program as part of a discussion, because I do think it's a situation where I think that encompasses every sort of, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum or the divide, the ideology. I do think that's something that all Americans should be mindful of, as well as the surveillance state and its increase of the surveillance state using the Russia-Ukraine conflict that as an excuse. And we saw it with Iraq, and nothing has changed since then in those terms. But without further ado, I'm going to bring in Caleb Maupin, and you know him. He is often on RT. He has his own show. He is very knowledgeable on communism and on what that means. And then, of course, we have Clint Curtis, who is with the podcast Liberty Lockdown and has come on here as well to discuss several things with us. So welcome, guys. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's Clint Russell, by the way. I know it's just a typo.
Oh, it's Clint Russell. No, I'm sorry. No, because
I know you know.
It's Pasta, and I have a friend that's involved in election integrity, Clint Curtis, and sometimes he calls you Clint Curtis, and I'm Pasta today. Clint Russell, everybody. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Spazzing out. But yeah, so thank you for coming on and having this discussion. I do want to start off by really defining what this idea of it means to you, because I think sometimes we get caught up in arguing with people. What is, and I'll start with Caleb, what is your definition of both communism and capitalism? Actually, let's start with you, Clint. What is your definition of what you see as what you think communism is, and what do you think capitalism is?
Sure.
And just define that for the audience so we know what we're talking about here.
Well, I mean, there's communism in like textbook version versus what we've seen in reality historically. I think that the more, I don't know, kind way of phrasing it would be stateless society, communal living, communal production of goods. That would be kind of the anarcho-communist mentality that I would not be in deep opposition towards. Oftentimes it is usually a state mechanism that has to get you there, and it never gets you there. So that's kind of my read of it. For capitalism, it would just be the free exchange of goods amongst consenting people. So I am an anarcho-capitalist, so I do believe that capitalism is a proper and good and just way of formulating a civilization, but I would like to see it done with as little government as possible.
Okay. Caleb.
I think both capitalism and communism are stages in human development. Most of human civilization was hunter-gatherer civilization, what you might call primitive communism or primitive communalism, tribalism. From there, we went to slavery and the slave empires of Egypt and Rome and Greece. And then from there, we got capitalism, which is a system of production organized for profit. It's when profit dictates production. You have private owners owning the banks and the factories and the major industries and the oil wells and the centers of economic power, operating them for profit. And communism is the ultimate goal of a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that all inequality can fade away, that people can just do what they feel like doing, from each according to their own ability, to each according to their needs. One of the only places that Marx talks about it is in this pamphlet he wrote, Critique of the Goethe Program. And he describes the ultimate goal of communism as being a society in which labor is life's prime want, meaning people only have to work because they feel like it, because they don't want to be bored anymore. A society in which the springs of cooperative wealth flow so abundantly that all inequality, coercion, and social hierarchies fade away. And it's based on vast technological advancement and vast abundance. And it's probably hundreds of years in the future. But the road to that ultimate world is what's called socialism. And socialism, I would argue, does exist in many parts of the world today. And socialism is simply a society where the banks and the factories and major industries are not operated according to profit, but there is a central plan. And this central plan eliminates some of the irrationality of capitalism and allows growth to proceed. And it overcomes some of the irrationalities of a system based on profits. And so that's the way I would see it. I would argue the capitalism of today is not, the original capitalism. It's not industrial capitalism. We live under imperialism, which is capitalism in its monopoly stage, the rule of the world by monopolistic corporations based in the Western countries that are trying to keep the world poor and hold back economic development. And that around the world, there are a number of countries that have broken out of that system and taken control of their own economies. And that is the beginning of socialism. But socialism really hasn't even fully blossomed into its ultimate fulfillment as the sequel, the overthrow, the next stage after capitalism. And my belief is that socialism would eventually lead to this ultimate ideal of communism based on vast abundance.
So I'm just going to pose both of you a lot of the critiques from, specifically the biggest critique from anarchists and from libertarians towards communism is the overpowerment of the government, right? Because the libertarian ideology, anarchist ideology wants the least amount of government involved, the least amount of the state. And I do think that a lot of that comes from the West, like the Western government, the Western oligarchy that we see in the United States, for example, has pretty much ruined things for people. It hasn't bettered things for people. So the involvement of more of that would seem counterproductive, right? And then on the other end, the argument from socialists and from communists and from people from more of a socialist leaning ideology about this libertarianism is or anarcho-capitalism is that there is capitalism in itself is a greedy mentality, because there is always going to be somebody greedy to try to exploit the system to where, because it's based on profits, that it's always going to lead us back into the same of what people say, well, this is not capitalism, it's crony capitalism. There's a difference between capitalism and crony capitalism, but the argument is it always leads to where we're at, which is imperialism, because that's the nature of the progression of capitalism, right? This is late stage capitalism. This is where it's not working. You have rampant neoliberalism, you have deregulation. And so it's hard to argue that that's something that we want to see as well. What do you say to that criticism, Clint, first, and then you can respond, Caleb?
Well, I think that greed is an aspect of human nature, and you're not going to rid yourself of it. I think that prices are the market signal for supply and demand to come online. So it's in effect the most, I guess, fair or motivating, equitable way of actually meeting market demands is to free the market and allow for supply and demand to match consumer desires. So I'm of the opinion that that's, greed is not done away with by having a state. In fact, quite the contrary. Power accumulates in the state. They have a monopoly on violence, which enables them to get away with, you know, the greatest evils that we've seen in human history. So I think that it's just a complete mistake to believe that you can do away with greed by going towards a socialist system. And I don't think that there's any evidence to demonstrate that a socialist system diminishes greed. It's just it's a misdirect, more or less.
Caleb, what do you say to that mindset, as well as the mindset that the state and the government oftentimes make things worse, in terms of that mindset, right? That just the involvement of the state in things is also a problem in terms of just too much is on the state.
Well, I think that first of all, we need to understand that freedom in every society is based on the level of development. No one talked about human rights or the rights of man or liberties until like the 1400s in Europe. And that wasn't because people were just naturally evil until then and didn't respect the rights of others. However, it was because no society had gotten to the point of development that could then raise the productive forces to the point to allow for that kind of freedom. And that the road to freedom is eliminating scarcity, is eliminating poverty. When there's enough to go around for everybody, there's no need to regulate how much people get. There's no need to have crime. That the basis of social hierarchies is scarcity, and the road to freedom. The more prosperous a society becomes, the more wealth that exists in a society, the more free it can be. And that said, when you talk about crony capitalism, all capitalism is crony capitalism. Every time you have a society where the means of production operate according to profit, and you have a small group of people who own the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power, they use their wealth to rig the government to make sure they stay in power. And why wouldn't they, right? It's just kind of natural. I don't see greed as exactly the problem. Greed means you want more than you already have. That's not exactly the problem. The problem is property relations. The problem is that we have an economy where the banks and the factories and the centers of economic power function according to the chaos of the market. And socialism is when society as a whole comes together, and the working class and other forces come together and control the means of production. And by doing so, enable growth to continue. And that's why China has become a superpower. They've had so much growth, eliminated so much poverty because they have state-run industries, they have 5-year economic plans, and they do have a market sector, but the Communist Party plans out what's going to happen in the economy and makes it happen. Profits are not in command, and that's the nature of socialism. And yes, it leads to people becoming quite wealthy. And yes, it leads to people being eliminated from poverty. And it certainly doesn't eliminate greed because people want to have more than they already have, but it puts rational human reason in control of the means of production. In a rational society, self-driving cars would be a good thing. It would mean there's less labor for everyone to do. This job called driving wouldn't be necessary. Uber drivers and traffic courts and taxi drivers and truck drivers could do something else. But under capitalism, self-driving cars would lead to riots in the streets, millions of people losing their jobs, hunger. That's the problem with capitalism. Under capitalism, the more efficient technology becomes, the poorer people get, because your only value in capitalism is your ability to rent yourself out to your employer, to sell your labor to a boss. That's the nature of the capitalist system. And it leads to weird situations. In systems before capitalism, like feudalism and slavery, if there was homelessness, it was because there wasn't enough housing. But under capitalism, people become homeless because there is too much housing. In systems of the past, if there were food shortages, people were hungry, it was because there wasn't enough food. But under capitalism, people go hungry because there is too much food. And we have situations where, like, the U.S. government, buys billions of pounds of cheese just to bury them in a cave in Missouri to keep the price of dairy high enough to keep the market going. Capitalism is highly irrational. And, under capitalism, the crony capitalism is the capitalists buying off politicians and using politicians to manage the economy in their interests, to make sure that, the government intervenes and protects them from the results of their system. But socialism is when the people come together and take control of the state for themselves. They win the battle for democracy. They take control of the means of production, and then they organize the economy so that growth is no longer restrained, so that society can be rationally organized and we can all get wealthier. That's the vision. That's the Marxist scientific understanding of socialism.
Before I go to Clint, I want to ask you this straight up, Caleb. Is China a socialist country? Is
Absolutely,
China
it
act-
is. Yeah,
it's operating in a very capitalist world, right? How does it do that? How does it operate in a capitalist system and making? Because a lot of people say, well, China is not. It's definitely not communist, but it's definitely not socialist. How could it be socialist if it's making profits and people there's small businesses? How is that possible that China is socialist? And because the idea is that you can't make any money under socialism. That's this idea that people have.
well, it's just not correct. Socialism is the elimination of the rule of profits, and in China they have a huge market sector. They have lots of small businesses, lots of tech firms, lots of corporations. But those corporations aren't free to just do whatever is profitable. You have a huge amount of state-run banks and state-run industries. You have a communist party with 90 million members. You have 5-year economic plans, and the state controls the means of production. The publicly owned industries, as well as the privately owned ones, are forced to cooperate with the overall central plan of the party in order to make the country wealthier. And it's been very, very successful. And actually, the strength of 21st century socialism is the micro entrepreneurship. You and I saw in Nicaragua how, the Sandinistas, with their government, the slogan being Christianity, socialism, and solidarity, they've raised millions of people up out of poverty by enabling them through a state central plan to start their own small business. If you look at Vietnam, what they call their socialist oriented market economy does the same thing, where the state plans out and has an economic vision, and state controlled banks lend money and state controlled industries coordinate. But they have a market sector that facilitates growth alongside an overall state central plan. Socialism is planning. Socialism is getting rid of the chaos of the market. That's what socialism is, and the goal is to get to a society with so much wealth and so much abundance that inequality and the need for a state and all of that can be broken down. And that's the difference between capitalism and socialism. And I will say that we have it in our heads that socialism means equality. Socialism means everyone's equal or something like that. If you read Marx, you read Lenin, they make abundantly clear that is not what it is. There is inequality in a socialist society, and unfair inequality. However, profits are no longer in command and the economy is rationally organized. And I think, unfortunately, during the Cold War, many of the communist countries, Cuba, China, and others, fell into the trap of trying to build a completely fair and equal society in poverty. They were barricaded. The capitalists blocked them out of the global markets, barricaded them, wouldn't trade with them. And so they said, okay, well, we're not going to be able to be part of the global market, but we're going to try to have absolute equality in poverty. And it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. The Cultural Revolution in China was a nightmare. In the early years in Cuba, I admired Che Guevara for his heroism fighting the imperialists, but his economic policies in Cuba, they recognized were not good policies. The country didn't really do well. You need to have material incentives. And so I think as we get back to the basic Marxist understanding that the goal is to create material abundance, but to get over the irrationality of the market that holds back that abundance, now we understand the nature of 21st century socialism. When you talk about Deng Xiaoping theory, you talk about Marta Harnecker and her writings on Bolivarian socialism. This is the contemporary understanding.
Clint, I want to ask you, he made a couple of good points regarding abundance, right? In the United States, we see a lot of homelessness. These are things that I don't see here in Russia. I don't see in countries in Latin America that are far worse off in terms of industrialization. They're not, they're developing nations are not at the level the United States is economically. However, we see this in the United States. We see rampant houselessness. We see just a complete and total disarray in terms of the inequality between a working class person and a person that is like a billionaire or a multimillionaire. Is that not then a product of the system we're in? Are there other factors that you think have affected what would be a better form of capitalism? Why then in the United States, if capitalism is such a good system, it's supposed to be the system we're operating on, right? Why then in the United States are things going so badly in terms of a downward spiral that we're seeing?
Well, there's obviously a litany of reasons, but I think that, first and foremost, Caleb made it quite clear that the central planning aspects of China is what he describes as it being why it's socialist. Well, the U.S. very much has that from central banking on down. Central banking being a prerequisite for a socialist society, and that's what anarcho-capitalists and libertarians oppose fiercely. So I think that that's the starting place as to why you have such misalignment in the economy. I don't believe that we function in a capitalist society. Far from it. But I mean, that's part of the debate that we're having as to has it ever been, or could it ever be? Certainly, it's a sliding scale. You know, there's no perfect answer here, and I'm not sure that you'll ever see a fully communist civilization either. And a lot of people will make the same accusation that it's just as utopic to believe that you could have a free market capitalist system without a government as it is to have a non-governmental form of communism. So, but yes, as far as the homelessness crisis go, I mean, first off, I didn't even understand what he meant by saying that we now have hunger by overabundance of food. Like, could you clarify what that even means?
Yeah. So basically what that means is that we have excess amount of food. Like every day there's so much food being thrown out, so much food being like completely just destroyed because they can't sell certain things at first of all, there's health reasons as well that you can't just give out food to the homeless. The other part is that there needs to be a profit made. And if there's not a problem, and I'll let Caleb clarify because I think he's going to clarify in more detail, but
Yes,
that is true. There is an overabundance of housing, overabundance of food, meaning there's empty houses that are sitting, for example, in LA, because somebody from another country or somebody that doesn't live there owns them instead of being used for the people that don't have a house because it's so expensive to own a home, that sort of thing. And Caleb, you can go ahead.
There's a classic story called the coal miner's riddle. There's a little boy and he says to his father, "Father, why is it so cold?" And the father says, "Because I can't afford any coal to heat the stove." And the boy says to his father, "Why can't we afford any coal to heat the stove?" And the father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine. They laid me off." And the boy says, "Father, why did they lay you off your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there's too much coal." That's capitalism, where abundance creates poverty, right? Where the more efficient the means of production become, the more wealth and goods that are created, the poorer people get. Where you have this glut, the market becomes glutted with products that cannot be sold. The worker cannot buy back what he is producing, and people become impoverished because of abundance. And our government has developed all kinds of mechanisms, like the Federal Reserve Bank and other things, to try and deal with this ongoing present problem. John Maynard Keynes called it underconsumption. Marx called it overproduction, but it's a constant problem in the capitalist system.
I still don't understand what you mean by people are starving because there's overabundance of food. Oh, so you're saying that because you're not saying that specifically, you're saying that as basically an analogy?
Yes, I am. I'm saying that as an analogy. People will lose their jobs because too much food is being produced and have trouble buying food because of that. It doesn't make any sense, abundance creating poverty amid plenty. This is what Marxists have been critiquing capitalism for many years, which is that it's a very efficient system, but that efficiency leads to poverty, which is highly irrational.
Well, I think that, I mean, from a capitalist perspective or the Adam Smith perspective, it would be creative destruction. That essentially, as prior needs of the market are met, it frees up people to evolve and pursue new market demands. And I think that's what you've witnessed with any major innovation, from horse and buggy to cars to the internet to AI. You're going to see people that are disjointed from their current line of labor and are forced, if you want to put it that way, into a new industry. But I don't view that as a negative. Quite the contrary. I think that it's to the benefit of humanity for us to solve problems and then allow a free market to evolve and allow the people to evolve towards meeting those goals and those higher level instincts too. I mean, the abundance that we deal with in this country, well, in my opinion, it is a product of the capitalist system from which we began. It's not ultimately, it's not the end goal here. Like you want to have people that are able to go down the entrepreneurial path and fulfill higher needs. It's not all about just working for the man and punching a 9 to 5. I think that's that to me has been the greatest personal satisfaction I've had being an American and living here, is that I've been on an entrepreneurial path for the past 20 years, and I've enjoyed it. It's been way more fulfilling than working for a corporation. The corporations, in my opinion, are very much crony because of the biggest government in human history. And I think that it's a huge mistake to point to the negatives of our current system and blame it on capitalism, when in reality these capitalists are only in such a dominant position with such a vast income inequality issue because of their relationship to the biggest government in human history. And you can't disconnect those two things. I mean, they are one and the same. The crony aspect of capitalism is not obligatory. You made it sound as if you can only have cronyism in capitalism. No, you can only have cronyism with state monopoly on violence, creation of money, the setting of interest rates. I mean, this is a highly interfered with, market economy. So it is socialist. That's my critique of it.
So you think the U.S. right now is operating under a socialist economy?
Very much so. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't see that socialist at all, because the people don't own the means of production. The government does. And I think that's
the people
where this
don't own the means of production in China either. And he called that socialist.
Yeah, well, I do think that the means of production are in a way taken into account for the people, though. For example, if you look at what's happened in China, there's one thing we have to admit: whether we think China's government is authoritarian, whatever we think of China's government, China has lifted its people out of poverty. I mean, I see this all the time. I saw this all the time in Los Angeles. People from China were coming in, they were buying property. There's a huge middle class in China. There is a huge ownership of property in China. And to me, that signals that a country is growing. And now geopolitically, right, what China is doing to grow its relationships with other countries on a basis of mutual cooperation, rather than this unilateral way. And I think you can agree on that. And the way the United States has conducted its foreign policy has been absolutely detrimental to our society.
Horrific. Yes.
So, but that we do have to admit, like, China has billions of people, and these people are not poor. We have less people, and we have so much poverty. Is it all on the state then? Is it all on our government operating? Our government is not operating under a Marxist system. Our government's operating under
it's a state-based, largely centrally planned economy. I mean, that is just unavoidably a socialist system. So,
well, I would argue that what we have in the United States is a bureaucratic form of capitalism. The government simply facilitates the making of profits by big corporations. But I want you to imagine for a minute that we had a government that was based in communities, based in the involvement of the population. They were heavily involved in the governing process. Every neighborhood had a community assembly. Every block had a coordinating committee. And we had a government that represented a mass movement of the people that kicked the corporation's ass, that kicked Amazon's ass, that kicked Walmart's ass, and but forced the economy to work in the interest of average Americans, and had an overall vision to raise this country up out of poverty. What we have right now is a bureaucratic form of capitalism, where we have a weak, pathetic government that does whatever big corporations want it to. I tell people, in capitalism, the corporations control the government. But in a socialist society, the government, which is based on communities, based on mass organizations, right, and a well-organized population, controls the corporations. I mean, right now, take science and technology. We are not producing engineers in the United States. Our roads are falling apart. Our bridges are falling apart. There is no central vision. It's just facilitating the making of profits by corporations. Our trains are derailing. Toxic chemicals are everywhere. Water is not being properly purified because the people at the top, their job isn't to make the United States a better place. Their job isn't to take care of the average Americans and make sure our living standards go up. Their job is to just make sure that Jeff Bezos keeps making more profits, right? And yeah, the government's involved in rigging things. And that's what I don't understand whenever I talk to libertarians. They have this notion that we're going to completely deregulate everything. We're going to have a completely private economy. And then it's just going to stay that way because everyone will be embedded in this idea that's the pure libertarian way. That's going to lead, if you deregulate absolutely everything, to a situation where some people have lots of money and some people don't. And those people with lots of money are then going to do exactly what we have right now. They're going to use the wealth that they have to rig the system in their favor, right? What we have is simply the result
how do you rig a system without the government?
Production. When a small group of people own the banks, factories, and industries, and most of the wealth is flowing into their hands, they're going to then rig the government to make sure it stays that way. And that's the nature of capitalism. Capitalism leads to the centralization of wealth and monopoly. That's kind of the natural outgrowth. And in fact, the government has all kinds of mechanisms to try and prevent monopolies from arising, all kinds of antitrust legislation and stuff, just because they don't want monopolistic stagnation. Just because they want people to keep buying stuff, because the natural result of the market is to have a few corporations dominate every field, and then the market goes into a monopolistic stagnation and the economy slows down. So,
Caleb, sorry to interrupt it. Clint asked a question: how do you regulate a system? How do you rig a system without a government? Right? Because your Clint, your idea is that if there is no government, the system will be self-sustaining with people in control.
It's just that there has to be competition. The fact that he laments the issues of monopolization, I share his concerns. However, the monopolies arise from government protections. Always have, always will. So it is the government at the crux of the monopoly of, I'm not interested in the government kicking the ass of Amazon. I just don't want them to kiss their ass. The reason that they have risen to such prominence is because of contracts with the DOD and DARPA and all sorts of other, handouts that the government offers to these businesses. BlackRock is the biggest money manager on earth. They were responsible for the COVID response and the bailouts therein. Not to mention that they propagate ESG through the World Economic Forum. Once again, kind of a globalist, socialist sort of push. I mean, all of these are problems that arise from overarching government and a monopoly on violence. You just can't disconnect these issues. And it seems as if you're saying that if you lean towards government, then you won't have to deal with all of these issues of capitalism. I'm arguing that the issues that you're lamenting when it comes to these alleged capitalist system are a product of the relationship to the biggest government in all of human history. So you can't fix it with more government.
Laws that the capitalists themselves have written to prevent monopolization because it is the natural outgrowth of the market. For example, it's illegal for a movie studio to own movie theaters. Why? Because they would just show their own movies. And then pretty soon you'd have one movie company. So as part of antitrust legislation, Hollywood studios are not allowed to own movie studios. That is the result, right? I mean, I used to work in insurance. There's all kinds of laws to prevent monopolization where you can't, if you sell insurance to somebody, they can't give you, on behalf of their corporation, they can't give you a fee because then they would only buy insurance from you. And there are all kinds of mechanisms, laws that the government has passed just to prevent the total monopolization of the market and prevent monopolistic stagnation.
I'm sorry, but that's just not reality. The
natural result of the market is that wealth will concentrate in the hands of the few. Antitrust legislation, the capitalists themselves depend on it just to keep the economy going. The idea that monopolies don't naturally occur, that's just any good economist will tell you no. Left to its own devices. I mean, there's a reason we have copyright laws, for example. There's all kinds of reasons that all kinds of government mechanisms have been created just to keep capitalism going because of this problem of monopolization.
I want to.
That's interference with the free market. It's not that you really believe that there would be only one movie production studio if not for that law? There wouldn't be a competitor that arises. If you look at it, that's the way. I mean, you look at the good old days they talk about when the Gilded Age, where there was a company store where companies didn't even pay you in money; they paid you in script, which you could only buy at the company store. Right? That was how monopolies develop, right? It's about maintaining an absolute monopoly. This is called the general law of capitalist accumulation, that a capitalist corporation, if it's not expanding, it is dying. And so they want to completely corner the market. They want to demolish their competition. And yes,
we saw
they want to. But can they if there's competition?
Invented all kinds of mechanisms to prevent this. The Federal Reserve was invented by J.P. Morgan, the creature from Jekyll Island. It was the wealthiest capitalist.
Yeah, exactly.
We have to have some kind of bank to keep the economy rolling again, because if not, the wealth is just going to concentrate in our hands, and the economy is going to.
You have that wrong. The reason that they wanted to create a central bank was because the most wealthy and powerful people at that time wanted to increase their wealth and power. The central bank,
Exactly.
yes,
Exactly.
but it's not
The
capitalism. To
market
have a
wasn't
central
gonna
bank is not
facilitate that. The
capitalism.
market was going to lead to monopolistic stagnation. So they needed some kind of mechanism.
That is not
And let me
why.
add, the Federal
You've bought
Reserve
the
is a
lie.
private corporation. It's a private corporation.
It is not a private
it's not even a
corporation
government
anymore.
You know, I mean, libertarians should love it. The printing of our money is not even done by the government anymore. We've privatized the printing of money. This private corporation is doing it. It's always better when the government doesn't do anything. It's not a central bank in the sense that Alexander Hamilton meant for a central bank.
It's a state-granted monopoly on the creation and setting of the interest rate.
It's what Milton Friedman, let's privatize everything. It is a state-facilitated for-profit entity that works in the interests of bankers that are in bed with the government. They appoint the board, they write the rules and regulations, and it was created simply to facilitate the making of profits by private capitalists. And it's a ripoff of the American taxpayers. We need government-controlled banking that's really government-controlled, controlled on community levels, controlled at a state level, controlled at a federal level. We need banking and the lending of money to be done in the interest of the community overall, not in the interest of private lenders. We need the credit. You know, I mean, this is, you go back, I mean, you know, if you read the Quran, you read the Bible, you read the Torah, all major religions forbid the lending of money at interest because it leads to a creditor class, a group of people that make money simply by having money. You know, they talk about, you know, usury. I mean, this is every major religion has forbidden that because of it. It creates a layer of people that just get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. And soon the government is in debt to them. And soon all of society is centered around them because they make money simply through having money. There's no physical value being created.
I think a lot of the disconnect here is this idea that the socialism for you, Clint, is that the government is central planning, that the government is involved in, and that's only the government, that people have no say, and therefore a government-less society is going to be more free in those terms that will allow people to make their own decisions, and then the market will just work itself out. I do want to ask this question because I think this is really along the same lines. There, right now, you mentioned the World Economic Forum. You mentioned the globalist socialists, right? To me, the globalists are the complete, total opposite of the idea that I have of socialism, a one world government where you have no say as a person. You'll own nothing, and you'll like it. Like, we've covered this a long time, since the beginning, since you know, this whole thing was coming out. And it's one of the things I strongly oppose. I oppose this idea of a world government where there will only be a huge government that will tell us how, you know, what to eat, like what to do, where to work, all of these things, so much control, so much surveillance. That's something I'm entirely against. However, I do not see that as being socialist. I see that as being fascist, a totalitarian sort of fascist government. And right now there's a lot going on in the geopolitical world stage where we have the United States, NATO, and their allies pretty much fought using this proxy war with Russia via Ukraine. And we know that they're spending billions and billions of dollars. We know that the United States, as Caleb mentioned, trains are derailing, things are falling apart. Now, we can blame the government, we can blame the economy that under this government. The reality is it's happening. And meanwhile, there's opposition to what the United States and NATO are doing in Russia and China. Now, my question to you is, because you did say socialist, globalist, do you believe that there is actual opposition going on? Do you believe that there's an emerging shift, a paradigm actually happening towards a multipolar world? That there is actual opposition from Russia and from China for whatever reasons they may have, that there is this opposition? Or do you believe that their governments are all in on this whole game and this is just another way to get us into this one world government where it doesn't matter whether you go to Russia or China, there's going to be these, you know, we're going to have the CBDCs and everybody's going to be controlled? Is there actual opposition to this global agenda?
Very much so. Yes. So, I mean, first off, you have to understand the U.S. dollar's central or basically its reserve status globally is the primary mechanism by which U.S. You know, hegemonic domination has persisted for so long, because they have now weaponized the U.S. dollar most starkly against the Russians, but also, you know, a dozen nations over the past few decades. That you are seeing more and more nations looking in the mirror and saying, do we need to actually be playing by the US's, you know, central banking dominated rules? And you know, rightfully they're saying, okay, yeah, we probably shouldn't be doing that. If we have a conflict with a neighbor, a literal neighbor just to our south, and they're going to, you know, cut us off of SWIFT and confiscate all of our reserves that are sitting at any of the central banks in Europe. It's a huge threat, and I mean, it's not a threat; it's an attack. It's just a financial one. So I think that the Chinese involvement in terms of brokering peace both in Ukraine and Yemen has been a godsend to the world. I hope that they are successful. So far, their imperial interests seem to be one of you know, trade with others, and I obviously I would prefer that to the, you know, militaristic imperialism that we've witnessed from America. So yes, I believe that the BRICS nation, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iran, India. I mean, there's a very significant. I mean, arguably more than half of the global population is now aligning themselves into that bipolar world order. So yes, I believe it's 100% sincere.
Caleb, when people equate globalism and this, you know, World Economic Forum, this push by these multinational corporations like BlackRock and all of these entities, and say Klaus Schwab, to communism and that, because um, where does that come from? Like, where do you think that comes from? Because when I'm looking at the World Economic Forum, when I'm looking at a one global government, that's not what it is to me at all. Because it's very much largely based on building profit, right? Making profit and taking away any sort of any sort of social incentives from the population. And in terms of what we're seeing now, in terms of the multipolarity aspect that I just asked Clint about, what do you think of that perspective? That is becoming quite popular, right? Where it's like, no, Russia and China are just going along with this. They're still as authoritarian as the United States because they're trying to build their own empire, so to speak.
Well, I think that the confusion is that a lot of people believe that communism is against wealth. Communism is wanting everyone to be poorer because that's what the World Economic Forum is trying to do. They are trying to save capitalism by driving down living standards and reducing consumption. They are trying to carry out a global transition to reduce living standards, reduce consumption, reduce the capitalist, reduce consumption, reduce living standards, reduce the population, all to save capitalism. And this is what fascism is. If you read R. Palm Dutt in his great book, Fascism and Social Revolution, if you look at what the Nazis did in Germany, where they created a slave labor underclass, they put half the country in prison camps and the other half in military uniforms. Fascism is an attempt to stabilize capitalism through degrowth. And that's what the World Economic Forum is doing. The folks who talk about globalism, I really wish they would go and look at what Lenin wrote when he wrote the book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Because what he was describing was the rule of the world by big banks and corporations based in the Western countries that are holding back development, keeping the world poor so that they can stay rich. And before the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin wrote that groundbreaking book, and he said capitalism has changed from Marx's day. We now live in the era of monopolistic finance capital that holds back development around the world. And the 20th century, Lenin predicted, is going to be defined by countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America breaking out of that system so they can grow. And what Lenin wrote came true. And in 1917, Russia broke out of Western capitalism and they industrialized very rapidly and built the world's biggest steel mills, the world's biggest power plants. They defeated the Nazis. They invented space travel. China broke out of that system and raised millions of people out of poverty. And you saw in Egypt and in the Middle East with Arab socialism and Baathism, many countries building power plants, raising people up out of poverty. We've seen what Cuba has achieved for their population, and that socialism is really countries breaking out of the dominance of Western finance capital and its efforts to keep the world poor and seizing control of their own economies and moving ahead. And that now, as the Western capitalist system is facing a long-term crisis caused by the computer revolution, caused by the efficiency that they have strived for. I mean, their own inventions of the computer revolution and their advances in technology are leading to a long-term economic crisis. They're now trying in an all-out, desperate effort to drive down consumption, reduce the population, reduce living standards to save their system. Meanwhile, if you look at what Russia and China are doing, if you look at what the Bolivarian countries are doing, it's the opposite. They're controlling the means of production in order to raise people up out of poverty. The battle today is between growth and degrowth. In Eurasia, with the Eurasian Economic Union, with the Belt and Road Initiative, growth is what's happening. Countries are growing, railroads are being built, electrification is happening, poverty is being wiped out, schools are being created, illiteracy is being eliminated, people are rising up. And in the countries that in Africa that are trading with China, we see a similar thing. High-speed railway, all kinds of exciting development, new engineers and new scientists. That is the wave of the future. They believe in growth in the anti-imperialist sector. But the dying Western financial system is trying to save itself by saying growth is bad. And they put Greta Thunberg out there and they say, how dare you, growth is bad, growth is bad. That's what they're saying because the only way they can save their system is with mass destruction. In the 1930s, there was an economic crisis. And how did they save capitalism in the 1930s? They blew up every major country in the Western world. World War II was a nightmare and millions of people died. But after World War II, we saw a prolonged episode of growth because so much death and destruction had happened. It had gotten the market going again. This is the problem of capitalism. Capitalism is historically outmoded. We, human beings, we're ready to go to a higher mode of existence, which is a rationally planned economy so that our creativity and our brilliance that got us from hunter-gatherers in the woods to feudalism and to capitalism can now lead us to yet a higher stage, and we can get toward that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world of abundance. Capitalism has become cannibalistic. It's eating itself.
You can't.
Question?
Yeah. I have so many questions, but you can't have a rational economy without it being naturally derived. Essentially planned one will fail, and you will see the same thing in China in due time. But regardless,
I've been here my whole life. It hasn't happened yet.
Well, your whole life? I guess you're young.
My whole life. China's
man.
always about to fall. They're about to fall. They're about to fall. And if they were functioning according to the market laws, they would have fallen by now. But in 2015, their stock market went down by like 30 points in a day, and everyone said that's it. The next week, they were right back up where they started because the Communist Party made a few phone calls, threatened anyone who short sold with arrest, told state-owned industries they couldn't sell stocks, and the market was right back up. Because they have the power. The market is not in control.
Yeah, they have the power. I mean, it's a violent, vicious power, but I guess they do have it, and I guess you can view that as a good thing. But regardless, there's malinvestment that comes with centrally planned economic systems, and you're going to witness that in China. I mean, you already have massive housing developments that are not being sold off, and anytime you try and centrally plan an economy, you end up with supply that doesn't meet demand. And that's what you'll witness. It's the same thing that you've witnessed in America because we are no longer a capitalist system, but in fact, a centrally planned one to a large extent and a poorly centrally planned one, a horrifically poorly centrally planned one. But I would like to know, first off, I agree with your guys' assessment that this is a largely fascistic model that we're dealing with, but I find it interesting that you completely discount the rhetoric of the World Economic Forum, which oftentimes espouses the very things that both of you have today, income inequality and equity and things like that. So are they just liars?
You want to answer that? Or I'll just quickly say, I do think that is on purpose. That the World Economic Forum has their whole agenda is extremely much so based on depopulation, population control, and profit. So therefore, they need to have people jump in on that by vilifying everything that and co-opting the language of what that actually would be. So when you have Klaus Schwab there talking about equality, why would you think that a bunch of billionaires coming together and deciding the fate of the world is going to bring any sort of equality? That's
Well,
an entirely different perspective.
I think it's
than
just as naive to believe that the CCP, the wealthiest people in China, are going to get together and decide what's best for the poor in their nation or globally. It's just naive to ever think that the most wealthy and powerful people are going to be the benefactors to the globe. They ultimately got to those positions of power because they were either the most intelligent, the hardest working, and oftentimes the most cutthroat. Whether it's in a capitalist system or a socialist or communist one, you're going to be ruled by demons. You have to have a free market in order for there to be competition, so that only the most meritocratic people can rise to that lofty height. And I just don't agree with your guys' assessment that it is remedied by turning towards the state. Quite the contrary.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party did not come to power by being the most greedy. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party started with 30 people meeting in the basement of a women's dormitory in the French concession of Shanghai. And eventually they had to flee the country to the countryside. They were in the mountains waging guerrilla warfare. It was a long 25-year armed struggle in which they finally took power, and they withstood all-out attacks, and they've organized the population, and they've raised the country up. I mean, that's just not the story. And if you look at socialist governments, they tend to be the result of mass popular movements where people get involved in the political process. I will say this, and this is really important to say, is I agree with your contempt for the ideology we're hearing from the World Economic Forum. And nothing infuriates me more than seeing them speak in the name of socialism. Because socialism is about growth. Socialism is about empowering people. And that, in the 1950s and 60s, the CIA began funding with, Encounter magazine in Britain and Partisan Review and the Frankfurt School and Theodore Adorno. They created an entirely different movement that calls itself socialism, but really views average people as the enemy. They say populism is the enemy. Socialism is the original populism. It's a movement of the people to take control of society and defeat the rule of the rich. But these people hate populism. They hate ordinary people. They view average working people as the enemy. They want to drive down the population. Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy, this stuff, Herbert Marcuse, this stuff that they push on the college campuses, this is not Marxism by any means. This is a very dangerous elitist ideology
but they do espouse
American intelligence. It was created by the Western capitalists as a way of countering the Marxist idea, weakening the influence of communists and Soviet-aligned communists among intellectuals. And that's really important. And it is anti-growth in its essence. It says growth is bad. We need to go backwards. And that's fascism. Fascism, if you read Julius Evola, you read some of the big thinkers of the far right, Oswald Spengler, it's about going backwards. They want to go backwards to a more primitive society so that they can hold on to their power. Marxism is all about the future. It's all about historical progress. It's all about raising living standards. It's all about empowering people, bringing people into the political process. And those people have no love for me either. I mean, they hate Russia vehemently. They support the fascist elements in Ukraine. They hate the Chinese government. They hate Vietnam. They hate Cuba. They hate Venezuela. They think socialism is an employee stock ownership program. It's just some kind of employee stock ownership scheme where you don't get a paycheck. You just get you get a share of the profits or something. Those folks that believe in degrowth, that are really obsessed with cultural issues, that have nothing but utter contempt for average Americans. They're not Marxists in any conceivable way. And the Marxism that I'm espousing here, this is the Marxism that I heard at the World Festival of Youth and Students, where the communists from around the world, communists from Africa and Asia, communists from Vietnam and Venezuela and Nicaragua, that's the communism that I espouse, which is very much the communism of the anti-imperialist world that believes in growth, that sees Russia and China as the future. And it's a different brand, and I admit that. The synthetic left, as we call it, has no love for me, and vice versa.
Here's the issue, and this is the argument, or this is my contention, is that while you may, lament their misdeeds, ultimately they use your rhetoric, and many of them, I believe, are sincere in their belief that they are functioning in your worldview, that this is the inevitable conclusion of Marxist ideology, that they believe in a technocratic elite, a centrally planned economy, so much so that
name one Marxist government in the world that doesn't support Russia and Ukraine right now. Name one communist party that's in power that doesn't support Russia.
I don't understand why that's relevant.
Well, because the global communist movement is against the World Economic Forum, is against the European Union, is against these forces. The real communists that are really in power, that are building socialism, they all support Russia. These people, they're the foot soldiers of the Western elite, and they can talk a good game, but real communists that are really in power are against the financial elite.
Okay, that's fine, but I'm still arguing that this is what in reality, not in the textbooks, not in philosophy, not in theory, but in reality, this is what Marxism ultimately amounts to. You get a bunch of technocratic elites that think that they're going to manage the global economy, which is what they've attempted to do. That this is why you have a World Bank and an IMF that does these predatory loans to third world countries, promising them that they're going to help them grow out of their impoverished, backward state. But in reality, what does it amount to?
Capitalism. That is exactly what Lenin described.
These countries that are part of the World Economic Forum and these leaders are all Western NATO.
Yeah, many of them are socialist.
No, they're not. None of these people are socialists. They're NATO.
All the Marxist governments in the world are lining up against them in Ukraine, on the Taiwan issue. Marxist
you're saying none of the NATO nations are socialist by your guys' standards?
No, they're welfare capitalist states. They're
welfare capitalists. All right.
Yeah, it's social democracy.
I mean, I would just call them Western imperialist regimes at this point. That they do. NATO is led by the United States. It does a bidding of whatever the United States wants. The UK, the Five Eyes, right? You have that. None of these countries embrace. They despise communism. They literally, when you become an American citizen, you literally have to sign that says you will never be supporting anything communist. You absolutely have to. You denounce it at all. I just don't understand how then the Western NATO states are supportive of that. They're not. They're supportive of the opposite, which is fascism. They're fascist.
I'm not saying that they're in support of communism. I'm saying that they espouse many socialist ideals. I mean, Caleb even said
they've co-opted the language.
Okay, well that's fine, but I mean, oftentimes the people that claim to be socialists in America say, oh, well, we don't want to be like communist China of the 1960s. We want to be like the socialist nations of NATO, of Eastern and Europe. So if they're not, are they socialists or are they not?
No, those people are not. Those people are literally the people that have just done so much destruction to the term socialism and communism.
I mean, you got to understand, it's hard for me to
I understand. That's like saying AOC and I have the same belief system, and I want to.
Oh no, I know you don't.
In the lead up to World War I, every Marxist party in Europe promised they would never support a war. And then when World War I broke out, they all betrayed their principles. And party after party in Europe, the German Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, they sent workers off to die, and 20 million workers were sent to die. And that's when Lenin and the Bolsheviks changed their name from the Social Democratic Party of Russia to the Communist Party, because they didn't want to be associated with those sellout organizations. And they make it clear what we're talking about when we talk about imperialism, capitalism, and its monopoly stage, and breaking out of that when we talk about the national liberation of colonized people. We're talking about something different. Social democracy is really just a mechanism for trying to stabilize Western capitalism. And at this point, it has deteriorated, I would argue, into a new form of fascism. And that it's really closely tied in with the color revolution apparatus. George Soros, he's the big liberal. He brought down the Soviet Union. He funded protest movements all across Eastern Europe to bring down Marxist and communist governments. And that, they talk about these people, they preach socialism, but they practice fascism. And in reality, when they're trying to reduce the population, they're trying to reduce consumption, they're trying to set the stage for new wars against Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran and all the countries that have broken out of Western capitalism. I mean, that's fascism in my view. And that's what these people really are. But it is an attempt to stabilize capitalism.
What I'm arguing is essentially that the tie that binds between the socialists and fascists, from my vantage point, from the libertarian vantage point, is one of a belief in a very powerful state to centrally plan things. And it ultimately amounts to power accumulation, a monopoly on violence, and ultimately the degradation of the poorest and weakest amongst us. So it's just, in reality, in practice, what actually comes from these systems is very much in alignment with what the World Economic Forum is now delivering. and I oppose it just as you guys do. But I think that it's a product of their relationship to the biggest states in human history that enables them to be in that position. I oppose the state for that very reason. You guys, to me, inexplicably still support the state, thinking that you can replace these tyrants and put better people that share your values into those roles, even if it requires violence to do so. I would just rather throw them off and not replace them. I'm an abolitionist ultimately, and for the life of me, I can't understand how anyone still looks at any of these governmental systems and says to themselves, "This can be reformed." It just so clearly cannot.
Well, the states that have implemented Marxist ideas are the very states that the World Economic Forum is trying to destroy. And they're desperate to have an all-out campaign to destroy those states.
And that's obviously terrible.
Yeah, so I don't see how you can equate the states they're trying to destroy with the World Economic Forum. I mean, they're on opposite sides. They're at war with each other.
But they're not. They're not really on opposite sides. That's the misnomer, or from my perspective.
A lot of people in the Donbass would tell you that there's a real war going on. And a lot of people are really dying, and that.
Of course. But my point is that they're not on opposite sides.
On another.
They're not on opposite sides ideologically, though. That's my point, is that they still believe in a powerful state. If they were truly on opposite sides,
and empowering people, and the other believes human beings are a cancer on Mother Earth and wants to drive down the population. Right. They are on opposite sides. One has a contemptuous view of humanity and a pessimistic view. The other has an optimistic view and views human beings as amazing creatures who've gone from space travel, they've gone from hunter-gatherers in caves to space travel and iPhones, and are capable of pulling themselves up and reaching a higher plane.
What I'm arguing is I wouldn't want Putin to rule over me any more than I would want Zelensky to rule over me. And I think that until that is actually the divide, they are still fighting the same nonsensical war.
Because you're against any state, period. So the only thing I want to say to that is that I believe that's a very Western view on states, because when you visit Latin American countries that are more socialist, where the people have so much say in their government, where the people actually like their government, it does change your whole aspect. When you visit countries like Nicaragua, where yes, there is a central government in Nicaragua, but there is also autonomous zones and autonomous societies that exist, and they call on the government whenever they want to, but they're pretty much anarchist societies that exist autonomously. They have their own leaders. And that sort of just works in that way. This idea that I do think, because for me, I believe in decentralization as well. I think too much centralization in government is usually leads in a negative direction as well. However, I do think that depending on where the countries are, the states are, they need certain things. I don't think anybody here is espousing that we bring on what works in China or what works in an X part of the world to the United States, because it's just not going to work. It has to be whatever would work for the United States. But the reality is some governments do work for the people. Some governments do work for the people. Some people do trust their government. We in the United States don't. We have a awful government that is far too powerful, but it is ruled not by actual Joe Biden isn't in charge. We know that the national security state apparatus is in charge. We know that corporations are in charge. We know Joe Biden is not in charge. So it's not the government. It is what is making up the government, which is the merger of corporate and government is extremely fascistic, and that's where we're at. And so I just don't understand how
I agree.
That we understand that we all agree that that's terrible. But the reality is it's not like that. Every state in the world is not negatively viewed by its people that way.
I grant you that.
If China like the way China operates, then that's their prerogative. We don't have to live in China. You don't have to live in Russia. You don't have to live anywhere that you don't want to live. The reality is some people really choose to like their state, and that's what it is. They're not forced to like it. Some people actually like their government, which is something unheard of, I think, for us in the West.
Stockholm syndrome. Some people like they're in prison, the prison guards. I just don't agree with their assessment. I mean, yes, obviously there's a sliding scale here. There are some governments that are worse than others. That's obviously accurate and true. I just think that it's also inevitably true that as the government grows in size and magnitude and income and wealth and power, it ultimately becomes increasingly corrupt. And I think that diminishing the size of the state to the greatest possible extent is ultimately to the benefit of the people. And I think that the mistake from my side of the fence that the socialists make is that they believe that if you turn towards the state to crush the monopolies, that you're actually freeing yourself. In reality, you're just empowering the state with the most dangerous monopoly that there is, a monopoly on violence, a monopoly on the creation of money. And contrary to what Caleb said earlier about the Federal Reserve being a private institution, in reality they exist as a monopoly with an explicit charter from the state. They would not exist if not for the state. Their paper currency would be valueless if not for the state. I mean, it's just so clear that it is an entity of the state. So
regular capitalism doesn't work. Even the capitalists need the state to run their system.
That's nonsense. That's nonsense. Yeah. They're not capitalists. Those people are not capitalists at all.
Gilded Age, before there were antitrust laws, before there was a Federal Reserve, and they had a panic every 2 years. Their system, in order to manage it, they couldn't even handle it. But I want to get back to what you said before about China, because in China they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. And they realize that it is very unique to China. It is specific. It's to address the problems that they have in their country, and that they have no desire to export it because it is specific to their country and their unique historical circumstances. And I have gotten widely attacked for saying that when socialism comes to America, it will be some form of socialism with American characteristics, rooted in our own culture, our own history, and addressing the very problems that we face in the United States. But here's how it will be similar to China. If you look at the Chinese flag, you have that one big star that represents the Communist Party. Then there's 4 smaller stars, and that represents what they called the block of 4 great classes. That was the workers, the peasants, the small farmers, and the national capitalists. And it was a coalition that the Communist Party built to defeat the Western imperialists who'd been keeping China poor. They'd had the century of humiliation. The British banks had prevented them from developing their own industries. And so the Communist Party put itself at the center of a coalition against the big foreign bankers and monopolies that were keeping the country poor. And they took power and they kicked the monopolies out of the country. And what will happen in the United States when we go to socialism will be similar. There will be a coalition of small business owners, factory workers, low-income folks, small business owners, poor people, working class people, people from all different sectors of society coming together to say, we want America to grow again. We want jobs and healthcare and education, not wars overseas, not poverty, not prisons for profit. And there will be some kind of anti-monopoly coalition that will emerge among the American people. And that government will take power, and they will adjust the United States and move the United States toward being a society where every human being is valued and the potential of every person is reached. I mean, the idea would be, here in this society, we view people, the government views average Americans like they're this contemptuous mob that needs to be managed, right? They're trying to figure out, do we just give them a universal basic income and let them just go away? Do we give them drugs to calm them down and pornography? But we need to view every human being in the United States as something that they can contribute, as potentially building a more prosperous and healthy country. We need to mobilize the population to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and highways and bridges. We need to use the natural wealth of America, the oil and the natural gas and the coal and the timber, to make this country wealthier. And socialism in the United States will come about as the result of some kind of anti-monopoly coalition, standing up to Jeff Bezos, standing up to Bill Gates, standing up to the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts, and rebooting the United States so that we can grow again. And I think it will involve trading with China, trading with Russia, and becoming part of this new economy that does believe in growth. And it'll be kicking the degrowthers and the Malthusians and the sinister forces behind the World Economic Forum. It'll be kicking them out of power and rebuilding the United States. And I believe it's going to very much emphasize entrepreneurialism, small businesses, worker cooperatives. That's going to be a big part of any form of American socialism. We are the American people. We are all about doing your own thing. And also, I think that it's going to be very Christian when it gets down to it, because the morality that many Americans have is rooted in their Christian faith. and that their opposition to a system that lets hungry people starve on the street and lets the country fall apart, where big banks make super profits, it's going to be rooted in Christianity and Jesus, who said that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And so I think we need to start talking about socialism with American characteristics, and that a lot of what passes for socialism is people on the internet LARPing and putting on costumes. But we really need to tap into the American spirit and find a populist value, find a populist appeal to how we can save our country from the nightmare of capitalism and decay.
I just have two more questions, and I can kind of wrap them up into one. So we just saw today a group of socialists from the Uhuru movement be accused of being Russian assets, right? This is a really big deal in terms of what it means to oppose the state. When we talk about the state of the United States, we're talking about the intelligence apparatus. We're talking about the military industrial complex. We're talking about people like Anthony Blinken, people who are so focused right now on vilifying somebody like Donald Trump, who I was never a fan of Donald Trump, but what is going on right now, just what is being done to distract the American public, to focus on things like this indictment on Trump, this arrest on Trump, versus the war criminals that run free, right? And just accusing people of being Russian assets. Not long ago, there was the Rage Against the War Machine event that I believe both of you were around there. Did you go, there. Caleb?
I was there.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And this event.
I called Joe Biden a son of a bitch right in front of the White House. It was fun.
I saw that actually. So many people were so against this event. So many people that, I consider to be on the left, Caleb, and they really were really against this event because, there was a few people there that they didn't like. And really,
I got the same pushback on my side, just so you know.
You got the same pushback on your side. Yes, this is really what I want to get to. How important is it really? I mean, we're having this discussion because it's good to know the differences on how we view things. But in reality, the reality is the United States government is literally taking the world every day closer towards nuclear annihilation, right? It's just disastrous what they've been doing. They've been pushing a war with China. They've been pushing a war with Russia, two nuclear powers. They're insisting on saying that Iran is providing weapons to Russia, and they are also instigating things with Iran, another nuclear power. This is not a winnable war. First of all, everybody loses in war. One, two, this is just not a winnable war. As mentioned, the BRICS countries already make up a far greater part of the population than the G7 countries, okay? And so that's a reality. We're seeing the dollar decline in its use. If Saudi Arabia tomorrow, and Pasta and I talk about it all the time, decides to trade in yuan instead of dollars, the dollar will plummet. Like that's the reality. And so we're in a very precarious situation where we're facing economic decline, we're facing nuclear war. And then we have people, and this is why I think Caleb gets mad and I get mad, these people that call themselves socialists and all this other stuff that focus so much on these culture war issues to distract. And I think that's both on the right and the left, that totally. they use these issues to distract and build wedges between us so we don't unite under a movement of anti-war. I really don't care who I'm standing next to when it comes to standing against nuclear war. And I think that that's something we can all get behind. Where do you see the state of the United States? And this is a question for both of you right now. With everything that's going on with the surveillance state, with the United States' foreign policy and where we're at right now, where do you see that? And what do you propose to do as an American to help alleviate as much as you can the situation?
I have a lot to say, so I'll let Caleb go first.
Well, as far as the Uhuru movement, I want to say one thing, which is I read the Department of Justice and their press release about it, and they accused the Uhuru movement of sowing discord. That's not what they're doing. They run a farmer's market so that people in the Black community can have access to fresh food that it's not available. They run, midwife programs for pregnant mothers. Like the Uhuru movement, if you look at what they're doing, their slogan, and I don't agree necessarily with their perspective on some things, but Their slogan is unity through reparations. So they argue that white people owe some reparations to black people, and then they use that money to provide services in the black community to facilitate after school programs and community programs. They're bringing people together, and that is why they're being targeted. Sowing discord is what CNN is doing right now. Sowing discord is what Fox is doing, what MSNBC is doing right now. They are trying to tear the country apart right now with a culture war, red states versus blue states, conservatives versus liberals, urban middle class versus Rust Belt working class. They are sowing discord as they try to grind this country into poverty. And the Uhuru movement and groups like it, they're trying to take care of people and build community. And they see Russia as their ally in doing so. They see Russia as an ally against colonialism. And Chairman O'Malley has made that clear. Now, and that's why everyone who is at all progressive, anyone who understands the history of COINTELPRO and McCarthyism should be coming to their side. But they're not. They're too worried about, they're too scared. They oppose Russia, whatever. And it's horrifying to me. And it's very similar to what happened with the Rage Against the War Machine rally. We're heading toward nuclear war. I mean, we're heading toward World War III, and we should be coming together to oppose it. And I have never seen anything like the internet psychological operations that we saw in the lead up to it, trying to get every speaker to fight with every other speaker, inciting people against each other. I wasn't even a speaker at the main rally, and I had all kinds of messages sent to me trying to incite me against other people. And it's very scary. They are not afraid of people doing what we do right now. I mean, I love the audience that's watching right now. I love the two of you, but at the end of the day, this doesn't threaten them. What threatens them is when people come together, when they build real communities and real networks of resistance, when they care for each other, when they create solidarity with each other. That's what the ruling elite is very afraid of. They want us all to be atomized, isolated individuals with no one to get in the way of the brainwashing they give us via Twitter, Facebook, and over our cell phones. They want to control our minds, and they don't want any family, any community, any religion, any political organization to get in the way. And when they see people coming together, that is what threatens them. And that's why my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, we have been pretty viciously targeted. People call us a cult. People call us all kinds of things. I've been attacked on a personal level. It's because we're building a real community. We're bringing people together, and we're teaching anti-imperialism. And we're teaching that our enemy is not in Russia or Iran or Cuba or China. Our enemy's on Wall Street. Our enemy's in the Pentagon. Our enemy is the billionaire elite. And that's why we're being targeted. They don't want any communities to exist. And that's what we need to understand. So conversations like this and coalitions like the Rage Against the War Machine event and real in-life rallies and demonstrations where people come together, that's what really threatens the deep state. That's what they're really afraid of. And at the end of the day, Clint, you and I are not going to agree on much, but we both believe in growth. We both believe that human beings are capable of going out and building things and getting to a higher plane, and they don't. The satanic elite that are at the top of global Western imperialism, they believe that humanity is just another animal. It's a cancer on Mother Nature, and they want to drive down the population. They want to roll back the clock of human history. And we believe in growth. Libertarians and actual socialists believe in historical progress. We believe in humanity. And that is a bond that, despite all the other differences, I think there's potential. And that's why we're both so strong against World War III. At the end of the day, the left is dividing, the libertarians are dividing, the right is dividing. There are some people that support Assange, and there's some people who oppose him. There's some people that support sending weapons to Ukraine, and some people that oppose it. There's some people that support the FBI and the crackdown on dissent right now, and there's some people who oppose it. And we need all the people that are opposing the FBI, opposing a new world war, opposing the suppression of Julian Assange, opposing tech censorship, from different ideologies and different perspectives to come together and figure out how we can build communities of resistance in this time as we're seeing Western capitalism in decay.
Hear, hear. I agree with most of what you said. I just listened to RFK Jr.'s presidential announcement speech on Twitter Spaces right before we started. And while I disagree with much of his economic outlook, as I do with Caleb's, I think that his priorities are much in alignment with my own, pushing back against the, monopolistic big pharma structure that exists. Obviously, it's state-based, but we don't need to get into that argument. And then also, most importantly, I think that the gravest danger to humanity at this point is the really the deep state of the United States, most specifically the FBI and the CIA. The CIA being the most grievous at present, simply because of their consistent push for color revolutions abroad, namely in the periphery nations to Russia. And I'm just finishing up a pre-release of Provoked, how the U.S. started the new Cold War by the great Scott Horton. It'll be out in a couple months, but he gave it to me early because I'm going to be debating Destiny on this very topic this Saturday live in Tennessee.
We've all debated Destiny here. Good luck. I hope it goes really well.
Well, it's specifically on the U.S. Support for Ukraine against Russia. So if I lose that, you get to kick me out of the Libertarian Party. That's for damn sure. But I think that there's, as he made clear, there are a handful of things that surpass in priority our other differences of opinion, and to me, there is nothing more egregious than the potential for nuclear war and World War III. No one survives that. It is absolutely mandatory that there is some unanimity when it comes to the dissent or the dissenting folks, amongst our communities, that we realize that there is a far greater foe in this particular moment, and we need to set our differences aside and work together. This is why I was there at the Rage Against War rally, and why I was very disappointed that so many in my camp thought that it was unpure to be marching with socialists or communists or whatever. I could not disagree more. There are times in human history where you absolutely must set your differences aside and realize what the primary concern is in that moment. And I think that this is the greatest threat that we've ever been under, and I don't think the vast majority, probably 95% of the population, has any fucking clue how dangerous this moment is. So I'm grateful to hear that you guys are in alignment with me on that, and let's pray that we can actually come together to push back against it. The nature of the war in Ukraine is one of constant and consistent provocation and infiltration from the West, namely the CIA and the State Department. But my God, they are absolutely sinister, and I this is why I think that I'm ultimately an anarchist and believe that the state must be abolished, is that they are now to such a magnitude that they are jeopardizing every man, woman, and child that exists on this planet. So may God be with us.
Well, thank you both for this discussion. It was very much needed. It was well done, and yes, I think you both make great points, and thanks for coming on, guys. I agree with both of you. I really hope that we can come together at the very least on issues like standing against nuclear war. We're as Americans, right? We really are the only ones that can take control of our government. Really, like we're the ones that have so much left to do there, more than anybody else in the world. So it really is up to us. So thank you both for coming on and having this conversation.
Yeah, read my new book. Where is America going? Go read my new book.
Oh yes.
In much more clear language.
Plug yourself in.
Read it fast before the nukes fly. This is Clint Russell. I'm the host of Liberty Lockdown. You can find me on YouTube. I just got back from a 3-day banning that I got reviewed and repealed somehow by some miracle. But I'm also on Rumble, any podcatcher, Liberty Lockdown. And I also do a comedy show, which is completely insane and irreverent and, probably racist and sexist, called Tower Game. So thank you for having me, Fee.
Okay. And Caleb, one more time, your book.
Where is America going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. That's my new book. Check it out. Available everywhere books are sold.
Sounds good. All right, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Convo out.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks.